All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on alcohol and sales tax revenue measures. Let's go ahead and start with introductions. Starting with you, John.
John Weddleton.
Pete Peterson, Forrest Dunbar.
Austin Davidson. Rachel Alto. Suzanne LeGrand.
Felix Rivera. All right. And then Fred Dyson, if you can go ahead and join us. Thanks, Fred. All right. So I'm going to go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I'm also on the phone.
Yes. Thank you. Mr. Constant is on the phone. All right. So I'm going to walk us through the agenda really quick. All of these topics were items that the members wanted to discuss, or at least you let me know at the last assembly meeting on Tuesday. There were a few topics that aren't on the agenda, and primarily those are because I thought those were best fitted to have discussions on the floor during our assembly meeting. But primarily today we're going to be going through fiscal plans, answering some specific questions folks had or topics they wanted to bring up on the alcohol tax and the sales tax, and then talk about any additional amendments. So let's go ahead and start with summary of town hall findings. I think findings is probably a really strong word to use, but everyone should have in your packet of materials the breakdown for each of the three town halls with two primary questions. Are you likely to support a new revenue proposal, yes or no? And then if you answered yes on the first question, then sort of a question two split, would you support the alcohol tax or the sales tax? So it's broken down by Anchorage, Chugach, Eagle River, and Girdwood. Any thoughts or comments on that? Yes, Ms. Alto.
So you got a yes sticker if you got to vote on the second question if you said yes.
Yes, on the first one.
The numbers don't quite line up in Eagle River.
Yes, so from what I was told, particularly in Eagle River, and I think, Mr. Dyson, you can attest to this, that Eagle River didn't listen to all of the directions exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions on the town hall findings? Okay. Then next is compare and contrast. We have the slide up here, but thanks. And then I think it's also printed for everyone. So this was just sort of picking some general categories, compare and contrast for each of the three proposals. For folks who aren't aware, the S1 version is the latest Rivera, Dunbar, Quinn Davidson proposal. The S2 is the latest Weddleton, Zalato proposal, and the sales tax S1 is the Dyson proposal. Mr. Weddleton?
I just say, I think we changed the start date to the February 1. It was my intent if it wasn't. Was it changed in the S2?
No.
Well, if not, I would make an amendment to do that.
When we vote on the 28th. Can't do an amendment here, but yeah, sure. So you want it to mirror February 1st,
Yeah.
just like the other one. Okay.
Mr.
Yeah, Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, so, well, there he is. So Alex tells me, I always want to know if I should tell the truth. Alex, correct me, but I asked Alex if the sales tax thing passed, in the administration. Alex kind of said, year and a half to get geared up, make it happen. I said, in anticipation of that, could we set aside some funds to start ramping things up? Not only the staff to collect the sales tax, but personnel and stuff. And as I understand it, Alex said yes, quite common to do. I think he called it revenue anticipation notes, and there could be. So the delay on the startup may not be as much a barrier as it appears. Is that right?
Yeah, through the chair, Alex Lifka, CFO, will affirm that if one of these things does pass, that we can start working almost immediately on ramping up the effort to collect the taxes.
Yeah. That's an important thing to know.
Got it. So let the record reflect that Mr. Dyson was telling the truth.
And the mayor, when he contacted me a couple of weeks ago, he said, I'm eager for the revenues resource to be available as soon as possible. And sooner is much better than more later.
Yes.
So that helps to answer that issue.
Great. Thank you. Ms. Solotel?
Thank you. Can we get the amount that it would cost to ramp up the alcohol tax? I'd asked and it never got answered, and I think it would probably be the same for both proposals.
No.
And the one for the sales tax was, I think, pretty substantial, but I will get the answer on the question.
You mean both alcohol tax proposals, right? Both alcohol tax proposals. Actually, I think we've had the number for the sales tax proposal at like $1 to $2 million, but we hadn't gotten it for the alcohol tax proposals.
I will guesstimate that it's something less than that. But
I had guesstimated the same, but I wanted to be a bit more specific. Thank you.
Thank you. Also want to let the record reflect that we've enjoyed by Mr. Perez-Verdia and Ms. Kennedy. So we have gone through, to catch the two members up, we've gone through the summary of town hall findings, and as I said, these really aren't findings, but if you just want to look at the vote. And then we're currently going through the compare and contrast with one edit noted by Mr. Weddleton that the start date for the alcohol S2 version is February 1st, 2021. Any other thoughts before we move on? Mr. France.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up question to Ms. Zelatel's question. I had a note that it would cost $170,000 to start up. That sounds low, I guess, for the alcohol tax. Wasn't there a C? No?
Yes,
There is a C.
Yeah.
Yeah.
there is.
I didn't think it was in there.
It is.
Great, so you all know the number.
It's 170,000. And
Thank
then
you.
2 employees.
2 employees.
2 employees, not 3. Oh, okay. Great.
Plus 2 employees.
Man, okay, sorry I missed it.
170,000 for, I think, the administrative non-labor
So-
stuff, and then 2 employees to run it.
Right.
I think in the C it's 174. So the total in the first year for the non-labor side is 170,000. Then every year thereafter is 2 employees, and I believe the C is somewhere in the neighborhood of 170 or 180,000 dollars for the 2 employees.
And then, was there any revenue adjustment made for either version of the alcohol tax? How much it would be coming in? So that we've been saying 11 to 15. Is that still accurate? And then while that's being looked up, any other questions? Ms. Kennedy?
Okay, thank you. In terms of the staff for the sales tax, 25 to 30, can you tell me kind of how we've arrived at that particular number, what we've compared to? And was that something that you already discussed? So I apologize. if it was-
I believe, just from memory, that when the information that the treasurer, Mr. Moore, was quoting was based on work that was done several years ago, and this last came before us in terms of how many people it would take and how much it would cost to ramp up the communications.
Okay, so does that take into account any new technology or software or anything that might actually help reduce that number? If it was done several years ago?
Probably doesn't.
Okay. And then my other question is, thank you, and what does the personnel status actually look like? What level of employee are those? What kind of transactions or what kind of actual operations do they have to do?
I would ask that Mr. Moore can dig up that information and send it to you.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gates?
Oh, no, it's just looking up the costs for some economic fix for proposals. Mr. Markensteps at least gave them an answer for the S version questions. Tax revenue.
Okay, so did you have, is it still that number, the 11 to 15?
It is still that number for the first year on the S1 version. They are estimating about 12 million. And then in future years, they're estimating 13, so they essentially kind of landed on the mid-range of 11.
Okay, great. All right, Mr. Gates?
Oh, was the question also about this Quality's exclusion for alcohol tax proposal?
If there's any updates in that, sure.
So this exclusion had a 2% initial rate and 2% revenue estimate, revenue estimate is 5%. So it's not the 5% of the original alcohol tax proposal.
All right, seeing no further questions on the compare and contrast, then we'll move on to fiscal plans for the various proposals. We'll go ahead and start with the alcohol taxes. I'll just go in the same order. So we'll start with the S1 version. Which one of you two want to take that away?
So you say it again?
For the fiscal plans, want to walk us through the S1 version?
Sure. So we worked with the administration to develop this Excel spreadsheet that you should have, and it's available on the table there for the public. Money goes into 3 buckets, as we've talked about before: public safety, child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence programs, and substance abuse treatment and prevention. We initially had built this based on a $14 million estimate. We got an email from Jason a couple days ago that said that they were now projecting a $12 million for the alcohol tax, and then we took out that $170,000 to $200,000 that we mentioned before about the administrative fees. So it was $11.8 million divided up in these 3 buckets. We spoke with the chief of police, the AFD chief, and Natasha Pineda, the director of the health department, to help develop these. And you can, I think all the categories are pretty self-explanatory. I'm happy to answer any questions. One other change we made based on feedback from a variety of folks and some of the edits that were made is we added the second line there, the additional prosecutors and public defenders. We don't know how many exactly, but we put $700,000 towards that. Let's see here. The core team, much like the S version, the Wellington and Zolotel proposal, we also put money towards the core team. That was what the fire chief said would be most effective. When it comes to the second main bucket, you all received a rather long email from Ms. Pineda today, going a little bit more in depth into some of these grant programs. So we've got obviously divided between the evidence-based grants and providers. That's for the child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence, and then early education, which is also a part of the harm reduction to children. And the vision, I think, in both those cases would be competitive grants going to nonprofits. Last, treatment center operations, we $2 million, and then night shelter and daytime engagement, $2.5 million, which is, I believe, about the same amount of money that was proposed in Ms. Zolotel's amendment earlier this year. So hopefully that would be sufficient to make a real dent. So that's it. Are there any questions on this?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to confirm, did all Assembly members receive the email from Ms. Pineda? Because it's BCC, so I have no clue if we actually are online or not.
I got it.
You got it? Okay, so it sounds like folks did get it.
Folks got it. Yeah, she unfortunately couldn't be here to speak to this, but we had a rather long meeting with Ms. Pineda and the chiefs. And we've had a variety of email exchanges over the course of the last couple of weeks with the administration trying to hone in on this. I think Ms. Hall is also in the audience. I think she'll speak later on about that's D. But I think it's important to keep in mind that these buckets weren't chosen arbitrarily, right? That we have constituencies that will help us pass this based on these buckets. These are also buckets, I think, that all of us have constituents, if you've been door knocking recently, that care very much about these particular issues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just point out, I guess, that this is sort of our vision based on working with the administration about where this money could go. Of course, they don't have the ability to obligate these funds right now, and that could change if, this is what we would want to do with it. So we're looking for feedback.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thanks. Two questions. The $1.7 million for additional sworn and non-sworn, this is a perpetual tax, so I'd be curious kind of what that portion of public safety might look like past the first year, kind of what the vision is there. And then on the shelter amount, that $2.5 million, if it's not meant, if none of the tax proposals are meant to replace already appropriated or already funded things, you actually want to maybe pull out the $735,000 we appropriated for shelter, because the hope was that it would go into the operating year over year. But if we were but if we were to full fund day engagement in first quarter, those would probably be one-time appropriations, so those would be appropriate to build into this. But I think that $735,000, the intention was it would go into the continuation next year.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I think that the police funds, those are perpetual. I mean, we're going to hire those 17 staffers or 15 staffers, but they have to be, they're going forward. Okay.
So
it's not a one-time cost.
So it would be forever funded out of the alcohol tax.
Yes,
Those staff
positions
would forever be funded out of the alcohol tax. Okay,
And I think the administration can correct us on this, but I think that's primarily true for anything that's outside of the tax cap, so new revenues, that this spending is going to have to maintain those positions. We can't all of a sudden just drop the spending because then the positions aren't funded.
And part of that, if I can, Mr. Chair, came from talking with the police chief, who I think is here, and recognizing Mr. Dyson has said this too, but the need we have. Most communities have far more police officers than we do. So it's not that, we do it a year or two and then we no longer need those 6 positions. So we envision that being a long-term part of the tax.
Thank you. Mr. Perez-Verdillo?
Yeah, just a few questions. I wanted to ask about mental health and how that fits into here. Sort of, it's not actually the word, that those words are not in here, and so I'm wondering if you see that as part of one of these funds. So that's one question, and I have 2 more.
So when we spoke with, I'll give you one piece of this, is the treatment center operations. So when we spoke with Ms. Pineda, she identified, I think it's called level 3.3 care as what they would do with that. So that's something that's a combination of substance abuse, behavioral health, and traumatic brain injury. So that's one way in which it's in here.
And I'm also going to just read the language of the actual ordinance, in which it talks about funding for substance misuse treatment, ... mental and behavioral health programs.
So that was what my understanding was. There was it's not in this breakdown, so I just was trying to understand that was still the intention, and that would fit under the category 3 here. Yeah, substance treatment prevention programs. Health, there you go. I didn't see that. Second is, can maybe someone from the administration can help me with this in terms of what we're obligating these funds for. So if the categories are public safety, child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence prevention, substance abuse treatment, prevention programs, homelessness, what is the restriction for us in terms of if this passes and then we begin to allocate it to particular things? What I'm trying to get a sense of is what is the level of restriction that we have based on what was in the language, and what is the level of openness that we have? So can we interpret this however we wish? Could we add a new category that is not in this? But we have to only fund within these categories, but we can interpret them in any way that we wish.
And actually, before you respond, I've gotten a request from members in the audience if we could speak up, because I'm having trouble hearing us.
Thanks.
Did you want someone from the administration to speak to that, or you want us?
Well, whoever knows what they're talking about, I don't know.
I think I know what I'm talking about. We can't go outside those 3, it's covered now, but those 3 buckets on screen there, those three categories. Yeah, there you go, 1, 2, 3. We can't go outside of that. Now, we actually do have flexibility within those categories to shift money around. So we gave you one potential vision here in this Excel sheet.
Right.
But if for some reason you said, well, we broke it down about a third, a little bit different. But if we said, actually, we'd rather do half child abuse and then a quarter for the other two, we do have that
So
flexibility.
we're not limiting ourselves to the percentage between these categories.
No.
And we are limiting ourselves to these categories.
Yes.
But the interpretation of what counts in that category, we can interpret ourselves. Is that correct?
I don't know if there's somebody from legal here. It's interesting. Who would have? I think someone would, maybe a private citizen would have standing to sue us if we were saying, "Oh, this is for substance misuse treatment. We're doing something, way out."
Right.
Of
I mean,
ordinary."
that's the argument I'm hearing. We're against a trust issue with the public, right? And
Sure.
so we create these categories both because we believe these are the right areas to focus the funding and to have a really clear relationship with the public.
Yeah.
So they understand you're not going to use it for whatever you want. You're going to use it for these things.
Right.
And so what I'm trying to figure out is how are we held accountable to those categories? So that's the question I have, and I don't know if that's a legal question or not. And if we can't answer it right now, it's fine. But that's something I'd like to have a sense of is that a gray area, or is there a real clear sort of lines of distinction as it pertains to it? And maybe Mr. Gates can respond to that.
Sure. Mr. Gates?
Well, my off-the-cuff response is this will become part of the charter, and if, I guess, there's taxpayer standing, if a taxpayer or someone who maybe is a contractor who's aggrieved by funds being diverted to something else, they would have standing to challenge that it's not consistent with these charter categories. And they would have, I guess, a substantive due process sort of grounds for that challenge. And they would have to show that whatever the money spent on is rationally related to these categories in some way. So we could have, I think, one of the things you said that I wanted to come to is, suppose 5-10 years from now, we've got this alcohol tax that will be in place, but the assembly that's sitting here 10 years from now wants to do something different, they could, but it's limited to these categories. So I think that Mr. Van Larsen expressed that very well.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The third question, and that is, in the development of this, did you discuss the idea of property tax relief? And if so, what was the reason that you did not include that in this?
I don't think we really discussed it. I mean,
So-
I just feel that, I don't feel that's necessary, I guess, but.
It's
I
also
don't know what
it's a
my
much
colleagues
smaller
think.
amount. Yeah, it's a much smaller amount than the sales tax. It's not like even if you were to dedicate half of this to it, you lose critical funding for things like police, but you wouldn't make an appreciable difference in people's property taxes.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add there. Thank you. All right, so going through the queue now, Mr. Constant.
Thank you. Mr. Perez already asked a really pertinent question, like how do we know what funds these will go to? And even in this conversation, I heard those three terms defined a number of different ways. We even included TBI in that conversation that I just heard, which is very much a broadening of the definition. And so I think anyone who has concerns about the use of these funds, that they might be interpreted broadly by the body, that is a reality. And whether the voters put a check on us by some lawsuit, a taxpayer or not, the fact is you and I or whomever are in these seats are going to have the right to define the outputs of these funds to fit within the categories. That's what I think tends to happen anyway. So just already in this conversation, it broadens from mental health, substance abuse, public safety to TBI, which is something else. So just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So last year when we debated the alcohol tax, one of the pieces of that conversation was, okay, the language for the charter change would be very general, and then later it'll come back to the assembly and we would create an AO afterwards that would specify some of those issues. So my question is, is there a need, assuming this would get on the ballot and if it were to pass, would there be a need then to go back to the assembly for a supporting AO that would further specify anything, or is this all that would be needed? Maybe that's either a question, I guess, for you guys, since you're pretty much all attorneys, and or Mr. Gates.
Felix, welcome to the club.
Yeah, I'm good.
Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
This ordinance, both the S1 and S2 don't include everything. They do include everything in the from the charter. There's a whole bunch of administrative provisions needed in the code for registering resellers of alcoholic beverages and making sure that they're in our database, collecting from them and doing the system for that. And these ordinances don't include those details. But those are more the administrative details of how to operate the tax collection program in the Treasury Division, and we work with the Treasury as it passes to make sure that we get those code provisions to the Assembly for approval and codified before that comes up. That was most meetings, perhaps the other sponsors or stuff more on.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, points they're going to make have been largely been made, but I think this is the categories you put here cover the field, and they're relatively broad. And in business discussion, I've been particularly wanting to avoid being too prescriptive, because there's so much in the future we don't know. How much the state is going to get involved in the mental health and the prison situation, the state's assuming felony prosecutions, the trooper's role, and so on and so forth. So, and it always will be a developing situation. Just having a conversation with Chief Dahl, and he said, if you were to ask me today where I put, 50 more people, I would do the best I could. But it's such a fluid situation going on that us being too prescriptive, I think, is unwise. But that makes people uneasy because we're not telling them exactly what we're going to do with it. Well, we can't. It's a balance there. Also, remember, as I understand it, we can soften things. We can stop doing things. We can lower the taxes and so on. We can't raise them, but we have flexibility within that. And as Mr. Dunmore said, we can switch the pots, and so on. I had some other brilliant thought, but I lost it.
Thank you. All right, seeing no other comments on this one, we'll move forward to the S2 alcohol tax fiscal plan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I put this together. This is just really some ideas. And I'll say Mr. Weddleton we discussed it, but he just saw it. So a few things on here. Tax administration fee that was blank is where the $170,000 go. It is not the total below that. There's a few footnotes because I love footnotes. And one is the presumption that we've already funded shelter beds at $735,000. What's not included in here, and it really should be probably behavioral health grants to Eagle River or Girdwood. I don't know. There needs to be something in these three buckets that addresses the needs in Eagle River and Girdwood. So it's a conversation to be had. I just wanted to kind of flag that under any of the three boxes. The core team expansion is numbers that came from the fire department directly, and that's really more, I call it core team 2.0. We know core right now is responding to frequent callers, but the envisioned version is really a mobile crisis response team that's much more significant than what we have now, and that's why the increase in price. And we don't necessarily agree with what the price is. It's just what we've been told. Same with Ingrid Safety Patrol expansion. That's just kind of a guess till we get more specific numbers. Day shelter, even it presumes, as I said, if we do it in the first quarter, those would be one time. And then the expenses, and then I believe if I have it right, the Alaska Center for Treatment expense for operating costs is in the right year based on kind of when, if everything were to go smoothly, and it would move forward. So And then there's some other questions of things that maybe it should be or could be used for, but I don't necessarily have numbers or timing for those things. And it's that variable percentage, so you'll see that up at the top of each year.
Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, thank you. I remember the issue. So this is for Mr. Gates, any other legal type. So under state law, the state legislature cannot mess with a voter initiative that passes. And it requires like 2 years. So 730 days and 3 milliseconds after the thing became law, is sometimes being, legislative one can miss. Are there any similar restrictions for us when a voter approved thing passes?
Oh,
Go ahead.
we do have in our charter a similar to your provision prohibiting changing anything approved by the voter initiative for 2 years. I would have a little footnote though. The language is about a initiative that's given as direct legislation, usually by a petition circulated for signatures, and then signatures brought to the ballot. But what we're doing here is being sent from the assembly. It's somewhat footnote because I'm not sure if that true provision really applies to something sent from the body to the voters.
Yeah.
I'm safe side to say presumably yes, maybe not.
Yeah, and that gets right to the heart of it. What I'm wondering is if the sales tax, well, any of these that passed, then is there anything that would keep Assembly from putting some modification on a subsequent ballot? So it'd be.
I can speak that nothing stops us from putting it on a subsequent ballot, going back to the vote of the people. But because we're amending our charter, it's more like an Alaska State constitutional amendment than it is like a normal budget initiative or statewide initiative. If that makes sense. So we are very much constrained until the charter language changes.
Yes. Yeah. But there's nothing that keeps you from doing it fairly soon.
But we could go back to people and ask again.
Yeah.
But we ourselves can't do anything on our own.
Oh yeah, no, you'd have to jump through the same hoops.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to reassure you that if we found out something we passed here needed some changes or improvement, there is a remedy. And I think Mr. Gates said here a few minutes ago that lots of the implementing ordinances that we need to pass, we have great freedom to do. It's kind of like filling out the regulations to make it happen. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Gates.
All right. Any other questions on the S2? Mr. Weddleton?
Not a question, but I just want to say thanks to Meg for getting all this together. I offered to help, but then I didn't.
Thank you. Mr. Perez-Rodillo?
So I just want to understand the thinking here. 2% to 2.5, 3%, staying at 3%. Is that just an assumption in terms of how it would progress? Would we have to vote to increase it each time?
You got it.
Yeah. So you're just assuming that if we did move it up by.
So this is just kind of based on costs that we can possibly see that fit in the buckets that we don't already fund through some other source, and starting at 2%. That was a progression, and really we didn't anticipate a significant change. Well, the whole percentage change to Alaska Center for Treatment might come online. Another key piece there that might trigger a change would be if a crisis stabilization center was ever brought online. Although we could only, under the S2 version, fund up to half of the capital and operating costs of that.
And then the other question is, in the first version, it looks like a significant amount of money, $3 million plus, is really granted out to other providers for child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence prevention programs. None of this is intended to be granted out to others. This is all to be used with administration, or not?
No, it could be granted out. I mean, this is just what we know is current hard costs versus the option for grants, particularly what might happen in Eagle River or Driftwood. It might make sense to grant to those agencies, and then also the kind of other things on the back kind of would maybe be more grant driven, but we don't have firm things about that. They would still fit in the buckets. And we don't have that similar designation in ours for that particular area.
Right, of course. And so that's, I'm thinking about, you know, this effort that's happening with the coalition in terms of really building the coalition out as a coordinating body, and that this tax, you know, is that this could be part of helping that become sustainable.
Yeah, and that's what's number one on what's missing.
Yeah.
And then I should say that Acreage Safety Patrol is currently granted out and paid through the health department.
Great.
Granted out.
And then I guess I'll just ask this the same question. In your development of this, did you and Mr. Welton discuss the option of property tax relief? And if so, why did you not choose to include it?
It was just a modification of the alcohol tax as proposed to try to refine it. I do have the question of why did the marijuana tax shift to under the tax cap, and why aren't we talking about that for the alcohol tax? So that kind of keys up that question, but I don't know the answer to it yet. I'm hoping it comes today.
Mr. Weddleton, did you have property tax relief as a part? Did you think about that as potentially being part of this, or was that not a thought?
Well, it's always a thought, but you know, the goal here was we need to do something new that's not being done, and to me, replace something that we think the state should do, but they don't. So it's just new stuff. Not doing that, and that certainly makes it more palatable to people, I think. But if we want to do that, a broader sales tax or something like that is my sense is the way to go. I want to make clear, when you say we vote, that doesn't mean another public vote, because we can go up to 5% of this.
Right.
We means the assembly will vote.
Right. Once, so I understand, if this were to be passed and voted on and passed, then the intention was it would start at 2%.
Right.
And then in order to increase it, it would require a vote of the Assembly to increase it.
Thank you. Mr. Franks?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually wanted to ask Ms. Zelatel about a comment you made regarding, I think, a wholesale tax of alcohol. Is that what you meant when you were talking about taxing alcohol in the cap?
No, I just wanted to know why marijuana was originally above the cap and went below the cap.
Mm-hmm.
So then it does offset property taxes, and the current proposals for the alcohol tax keep it above the cap. So I'm not sure why we're treating them differently, or what. I don't know enough about the back history of the marijuana tax, perhaps. So, looks like.
Yeah, Mr. Dunbar?
Well, I think I could partially answer that. I don't know, Mr. Falsey or someone else who's more familiar with this can remind me, but I don't think it didn't go under the tax in a traditional way like the fuel tax did. I think what happened is we had a certain amount of time where we could have raised it on our own, and then once that expired, the tax jumped up. So it didn't immediately offset property taxes. It
Strong no.
Yeah.
Instead of
well, did it all just go under to offset property taxes?
No.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but what you're saying is also not.
I thought it was absorbed into the tax cap, and the tax cap increased by the amount of the alcohol of the marijuana tax, the 5% marijuana tax.
That is my recollection.
Yeah.
And my recollection was partly structured that way because it was highly uncertain what the marijuana tax was going to do in the first several years, because the industry had to come online and the volumes were going to change wildly over the first several years. So there was sort of a 3-year ramp-on period until the marijuana tax had effectively stabilized. And then the tax cap jumped to capture that amount. So now it's all
What he said.
Yeah. Okay.
But could I continue on?
Sure.
But that was in, when we voted for the marijuana tax, that was required, right? So we have to do it because it was in what we voted on, and it's not in this.
Can I ask a follow-up to it? For those who know, why was it contemplated that way, or why was it put on the ballot that way versus just all above the tax cap?
We lost that knowledge with big training.
Well, he's here.
It was specifically to provide property tax relief.
Oh,
Because the presumption was that the amount of money that was going to come in wasn't going to provide that much of a bump, and so it was deliberated and voted to go under the cap after it had stabilized. And for this body to contemplate, you can always provide property tax relief at any time, regardless of language on a ballot. You just have to make that move when you have a budget. So it doesn't, this guarantees it, but that is something that the Assembly can entertain at any time.
Mr. DeBar.
But effectively, because we were taxing to the property tax cap, and then alcohol and then marijuana was outside of that, so we increased our spending, and we were taxing to the cap plus all the marijuana expenses to do things like hire more police officers and that kind of thing. So I think you can interpret the jump in the property tax cap as not the tax cap, not as property tax relief, but as absorbing that new amount of spending. I mean, I think there actually was new spending that came out of the marijuana tax proposal as opposed to just property tax relief.
Okay. Thank you. All right, I don't see any other questions, so we'll go ahead and move on to the sales tax S1 fiscal plan. Mr. Dyson.
Thank you. So, the regressivity thing, and it came out here pretty well in our last meeting. Property tax for homeowners is significantly regressive, and probably all of you know some folks, particularly retired folks and so on, are hanging on with their homes and with a very prescribed income. And property tax is going to make some difference to them. And as Mr. Weddleton pointed out, as he often does, can make a significant difference to small businesses. I don't know how it is in your neighborhood, but I can tell you, Ms. Kennedy's my neighborhood, there's a whole lot of vacant space in the strip malls and other buildings around, and so on and so forth. And small businesses are out there on the margin, and we're losing them. These aren't, the property tax relief is not going to change their world, but it's going to change it marginally, and for some it'll be enough, a few, but make a difference. The same way, and it was just something I heard from I think a city or state chamber, but just talking about we need to attract business, and we want to be open for business and so on. And I don't think we should be uncomfortable when big corporations decide that we're a community to invest in, and they make money here, and property taxes probably nothing like the portion of their overhead for a big business like it is for a little one. But I mean, this is true when Pete and I and others were working in the oil business. We want to get our fair share out of it. We don't want to scare those guys away, and we want to have a fair, predictable tax environment and so on. So it's a balancing act, but we want to be open for business. The best thing we can do for most people that are financially disadvantaged is to have employers bidding for their service, and the marketplace for jobs and so on. So the more we can do to encourage businesses to stay open and new ones to come has some positive effect. And there's no argument against what I just said, but it's certainly a part of it. We have exempted so much of what is life's necessities with the list of things that won't be taxed, but I think that the regressivity will be an almost unnoticed burden for poor folks and so on. And Mr. Gates has prepared for me an amendment, and I kind of got this idea from Forrest, but is to make our sales tax 2% in the summer and 1% in the winter. So it's progressive, and it hits more of our visitors and so on, and so on. So just think about it. At Forrest, 2%. Somebody's going to buy a $10,000 car, $200. It's just not going to be that big of a factor. And you lawyer folks do better at reading and digesting words on a page and so on, but I misread something that was in our original version here and still in the S1. I thought it said that you pay no tax on a one-time purchase up to $10,000. What we have here is, I think, what Bill Evans had years ago, is you don't pay it. What does it say?
So, Mr. Evans' proposal set the maximum amount of tax $200, so it would be a purchase of $10,000, that just raised $200, but we cap it at $200, so from the zero to the maximum amount of tax is what could be collected. And Mr. Dyson had accepting the first $10,000 purchase and taxing anything above that.
Yeah, so I think I messed it up, and I think what Bill Evans had is better than what I had, and it would say, except for the first $10,200, you pay sales tax. And I think that solution was better than mine. But think about that. I don't think I have anything else to say. I'm glad to answer any questions, and I'm very glad to hear suggestions.
Sure, so I think we're going a little bit out of order on the agenda, but that's okay. So we're talking about the regressivity part. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Oh, specifically about that.
Sure,
Not,
yeah.
not about an amendment that Mr. Dyson mentioned. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So, Mr. Dyson, you mentioned switching it to 2% in the summer and 1% in the winter. And so we've talked about doing these seasonal taxes, and it's been explained to us that that's difficult to do for administrative purposes. Is that not the case if you always have some baseline tax and you just raise it or lower it versus having none at all and then having?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, intuitively, I think it's exactly right, and just going up, one or down, and they're starting to do that out in the valley. If they can do it, we can sure do it. We can figure it out.
Yeah, they have good for the police force, so.
Sorry?
Oh, nothing. They're heavily subsidized by the state. That'd be nice to.
Oh, that'd be nice.
Thank you. Any other comments on the regressivity? Yeah, Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a question that came up was concerning medical-related exemptions. So what exactly then is exempted under the category of medical? I know that everything when it comes to like WIC and prescriptions, but as far as like medical supplies and equipment, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I assume what it means is anything with a license, the doctor prescribing or nurse practitioner and so on and so forth. It doesn't exempt over-the-counter stuff, as I understand it. And the last 2 or 3 times I had surgery, all the medical equipment would have been reimbursed because the doctor wrote a script for it. You know, so anything that's in that category, I assume, is not taxed.
Oh, no, what Mr. Dyson says is correct. That's my understanding as well. Prescription medications are exempt, but not over-the-counter medications. And I think that's a very common arrangement in many sales tax jurisdictions.
Thanks.
Right now, the way it's written says medical goods prescribed by a physician or pharmacist, and sometimes that might be medical equipment. The physician says you need a wheelchair or I think that would fall into the exemption, and part of this subject to Treasury's interpretation of this language. I have seen some other jurisdictions that have an exemption specifically for certain types of medical equipment designed for accessibility purposes, things like that. So, and I would remind you that one other change that we made to Mr. Dyson's S1, it initially said, or excuse me, one of the amendments we made initially said that this list of exemptions is approved by the voters, but we changed that in this amendment. So even after this passes, we simply could amend these exemptions listed in his proposal, page 11.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, he said we can subtract but not add. What's the order to do it? True.
Oh, can subtract but not add?
We've taken out the exemptions are approved by voters, so the assembly could prescribe exemptions. That's all we authorize in the charter and any language. So you feel free, the assembly feel free to add or subtract exemptions that are here in this ordinance amendment code. You could amend that code provision.
Okay.
You can add.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments on the regressivity subject? Okay. Then I just want to go back. Mr. Dyson, did you have anything other than what you presented to us on the fiscal plan? So what do you intend to do with the money, or what your ideas are for the money raised from the tax?
No.
Okay.
But I want to be clear that the administration, Alex, they're okay with when if the public safety expenditures can't responsibly spend all the money within each calendar year, that money defaults to property tax relief. Oh, and to another earlier question, I have been telling people, and I think I said it in the assembly memorandum, that it is our intention, and we'll have our auditors, BDO, track this money, how it gets spent. And we can look citizens in the eye and say, one of the better auditing firms around, is going to be tracking this, and we're doing the best we can to make sure that crooked public officials like us don't misuse the funds. I didn't quite say it that way.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That raised another question as far as audit costs. Would that be included in administrative costs and could be covered out of proceeds? I assume that would be the case.
Yeah. No, at our last meeting, I asked that very question, and the BDO guy said, we can add emphasis on different things at your request. If it got really extensive and detailed, then they come back and ask for an add-on to their contract. That's almost an exact quote.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't remember that. I have a couple
Oh,
other.
lots of kids don't pay attention.
Thanks, Fred. Go ahead, Mrs. Prince.
Thanks. Let the record reflect I was paying attention. So, two questions. John and I were down in Girdwood last night, and they raised the question again about, is there anything specifically in the language of your proposal that would preclude police or public safety support to Girdwood? And the answer is still no, as I understand it. Okay, not Ona and Jason are also nodding yes.
Yes.
Okay, and then the second question was, and I think you already covered this, but I'm getting the three proposals, they're overlapping a bit in terms of offsetting the cost to business. Okay.
To what?
To business for implementing the implementation costs.
Yeah, I think there's something in there about $3,000.
Okay.
For that.
I couldn't remember what, I know one of the alcohol proposals, or did both have the inventory tax? No, just the S2. Okay, the S2. And then yours, Mr. Dyson, has language that addresses that cost in a different way. Okay.
I'm sorry, offsetting the cost of business, that's not in the alcohol tax ordinances, but the alcohol tax proposals, both are just charter amendments, the alcohol amendments, and when you have a code chapter out of alcohol tax, you could have that time filing allowance for those tax creators, alcohol retailers. That's not currently drafted yet, but it could be. So in Mr. Dyson's proposal, yeah, there's time filing allowance. It's actually a common feature that's added that sort of incentivizes the retailers to submit and remit their taxes on time, and if they don't submit it timely, they use that ability to get this allowance. We had an amendment that changed it from 3,000 to 1,000, 2% of the amount of tax that the retailers committing, whichever that's maximum $1,000 as a town guide, it's for us in cost business.
Each year?
In a calendar year.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to bring up that the three of us talked about John's idea of giving some relief on inventory. And, you know, that doesn't happen with marijuana. It doesn't happen with all kinds of businesses. For instance, car dealerships that hold a lot of inventory. There are all kinds of businesses in Anchorage that don't have that benefit, and we felt it would be unfair to only implement that for alcohol.
Thanks. Mr. Weddleton?
I'd like to say, no business that has inventory is free of it. We all have to pay it.
But you want to exempt alcohol.
I think in this case, because they are focused on directly as for the tax, yes, should it have been done for marijuana? It does seem like intuitively we should, and maybe we should revisit that. But I would say, you know, if you are worried about this passing, which you should, because the alcohol industry is, I think, irrationally fighting it, seeing doom that puzzles me. They know their business better than I do. But any business can look and see exactly how much they're paying on inventory tax. And it's painful, and it's odd that we do that. No one else does. It's just not, I don't know why we have to pay inventory tax. It's very bizarre, but we all do. So you free them enough, they can do the math and go, gosh, I'll save that amount. And I hate that tax. The 5%, the damage to their business on that is very speculative, right? Because they're not paying it. You are, whoever, right? But they can do the math on that. And I suspect that will take the wind out of a lot of opposition. If you say, you know, this thing you hate goes away.
Yeah.
There's no loss in income to the business.
Are you guys having a hard time hearing him?
Yes.
He's just suggesting, I think, that it would take the wind out of the alcohol industry's sales if we gave them that.
I always find it goes better if everybody just nods and says yes. Whatever. So feel free. But that's something to consider there. Should we give a break to other businesses? Yeah. Okay. We can work on it.
I mean, that's certainly something we could consider. I don't feel comfortable doing it for one industry right now.
Thanks. All right, so we're going to, Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, I sure hear about it. Now, my understanding is licensed vehicles don't pay the inventory tax. It's the unlicensed one. And we have people regularly warehousing stuff out in the valley. It's just-in-time service. Oh, Mr. Dunbar, give me your credit card. And yeah, it'll be here in 35 minutes, you know, that kind of thing. And I've thought about at least saying you don't have to pay it on the same item twice. You pay it on 1 year, you know. But another day, something for you to do the rest of your career.
We still got February and March, Brett.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the specific subjects folks wanted to talk about for the alcohol tax. We'll start with the polling information. Who's here to speak on that? You can go ahead and come up. Let's go ahead. Have you. And if you could introduce yourself for the record.
I'm Tiffany Hall, I'm the Executive Director of Recover Alaska.
You're the one I just talked to on the phone?
Yes. I'm sorry I haven't connected with all of the Assembly members yet. I'm slowly making it through. I think I'm about 2/3 of the way through individual calls. And we have a copy of a memo that we made, but it doesn't have all of the very specific numbers in it, partially for strategic reasons. I know that I'm about to say them in a public meeting, but we have been trying to keep some of our information close to the vest in terms of industry opposition finding out about it. But just to address some of the questions that I've heard, either at these work sessions or at assembly meetings, Recover Alaska has been working on researching alcohol taxes since I started, and before I got there, I started at the beginning of 2016. A statewide alcohol tax increase was in one of Governor Walker's proposals, so we looked into it then. We've done 4 different rounds of polling, 2 statewide, 2 specific to Anchorage, with 4 different organizations to make sure that our results weren't skewed based on who was doing the poll and exactly how. In every single one of those, the majority of voters are in favor of an alcohol tax. I know that did not come true. at the ballot box last year, but I think a large part of that was because there was no well-funded campaign to reverse some of what voters were hearing from the alcohol industry, much of which was false. I will say that in the 2 most recent rounds of polling that we did, we asked voters and potential voters where they would like the funds directed. First, we asked them why they did or didn't vote for an alcohol tax, and a lot of what we heard is that they did vote for it because funding went to treatment, because funding went to homelessness services, or because funding went to the right areas. A lot of the people who didn't vote for it because they opposed taxes in general, or they thought that the amount of the tax was incorrect. So we took those results and refined them a little bit more and did another round of polling to find out just homelessness, or what does that look like, and public safety, what does that look like. And when we asked voters what they were interested in, if they were interested in an alcohol tax passing, the top 3 places they would like the funding to go, 78% said prevention of child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence. 73% said additional substance use disorder treatment, and 65% said police and first responders. 61% specifically said Brother Francis and Beans Cafe, and everything underneath that was less than 50%. So those top 3, we discluded Brother Francis and Beans because it's kind of, well, I mean, we didn't disclude it, but we built it in to just say homelessness services rather than specifically those. So that is what we brought to the Assembly sponsors as the top 3 areas we would like to see funded. And just to say out loud, Recover Alaska would not be a beneficiary of any of these funds. The reason that we are so committed to this effort is because of the public health aspects of it, which we'll get to in the next bullet item on the agenda. But just to say, we also polled things like roads to see if people were interested in funding going to better roads. It did not win, but I don't have a dog in the fight in terms of where funding really goes. So we just wanted to really hear what the people were saying. We also asked them about alcohol tax versus sales tax. And what we heard, which is a little bit different from the town hall results, is that 63% of voters were more in favor of an alcohol tax, whereas 25% of voters were in favor of a sales tax. We also asked them about property tax relief and if including property tax relief would help them to vote yes. And only 28% of people said they would be more likely to vote for it with property tax relief, so we did not include that, since we thought if it's only 28%, we like all of the funding available to new services. We also asked about a sunset of the tax, and we had 2 different, it was either 46% or 22% would be more likely with a sunset of the tax. And for the public health reasons behind it, I would not be in favor of a sunset, so we also did not include that. The one other piece that we've seen before and that we've talked about here is whether they'd be more likely to vote for it with more reporting back of how the funding was being spent, how those programs are going, and 22% said they'd be more likely with reporting. And just to put out there, 60% of voters said that they would be more likely to support a candidate who they know favors an alcohol tax. Just to say that out loud. Those are the primary polling results. I'm happy to try to answer questions if people have them. I guess one other thing to say, and this was not done by official poll, but just in my personal exchanges with the alcohol industry since 2016, to kind of address what was just being talked about, is that they have very definitively and obviously told me they will not be decreasing their opposition to an alcohol tax, kind of for any reason. So just to say about this inventory tax, not only might it be a little bit unfair to allow alcohol to do that and not marijuana, but also it's kind of like the extended hours from last year. No one was at the assembly meeting to speak in favor of those extended hours, but it was put on the ballot, and the alcohol industry still raised $377,000 to fight it. So I just really don't foresee them lessening their opposition to an alcohol tax, period.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thanks. You said that this was a number of polls or 4 different polling opportunities. What's the timing or the timeline of the time period in which the polls took place, and what is the sample size for each poll?
So the first two were both statewide, and so and those were done in 2017 and 2018, and so those, all of the numbers that I said out loud today aren't from those polls. We just kind of use those just to say, in general, people did support an alcohol tax also, but excuse me, the two polls that I did pull numbers from were done over the summer of this year, and then again in October of this year. The first poll questioned 595 residents, and the second poll sampled 400 residents. Both of the 595 residents are people who did vote in April. The 400 are people who are very likely to vote in the coming April.
Can I ask a follow-up? Did those include folks in Eagle River, Chudiak, and Girdwood?
Yes, and the sample was also weighted for representative distribution by age, party affiliation, and gender as well. And we are, I don't have this yet. It might actually be in my inbox. Haven't quite gotten through yesterday's backup, but we are asking for breakdowns by assembly district.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson?
I'm good. I was asking what you guys.
Okay. Mr. Weddleton?
A couple things. I guess a comment, the idea of extending the hours last year was not important to the industry because they wouldn't make much money on the inventory tax. Is something they can calculate, and there wasn't much comment on it because it came in late in the game. Just amended it in their last meeting. But the few bar owners that I brought it up to, they went, oh, that's something different. So it is a mood changer thing. So the 60% threshold that's in the charter, you must ask about that, how that would happen.
We did ask about that, and I can't believe I don't have that number right in front of me, but we did ask about it, and I have to believe that it was not as impactful as the things that we did choose to look at, or we probably would have looked at it further. But also, I just feel like getting to the 60% threshold will be very difficult. I think it'll be difficult to get to the 50% threshold. And I hear where you're coming from about that it is in the charter and you want to respect that even if other court cases say that it's unconstitutional, and I am not a lawyer and don't fully understand all of the things. So I hear and respect why you would want to maintain the 60%, but just from where I am, both as a voter as well as somebody who is working to fund this campaign, I think that 50% plus one is a smarter move.
Can I make a comment? The 60% threshold for sales tax is not unconstitutional at all. That's never been stated. It actually was very clear that it is constitutional. The court case that said the 60% threshold to change the charter, that is unconstitutional.
Thank you.
But the
I misspoke.
60%, you don't want a sales tax for that was allowed to go through because it is constitutional.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Who did the polling for you?
The most recent ones were done by Hayes Research Group and Alaska Survey Results.
Right, so they were phone surveys?
One was an online survey and one was a telephone survey.
Telephone survey only do landlines?
No. I'll have to double check that. I can send out the methodology.
Yeah, it was not really important, but I understood.
I think it was a combination of landlines and cell phones.
So it's intriguing me how they get our cell phone numbers. That's an issue, but thank you.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other statewide polling that we did the second round of it was done with the numbers provided to the permanent fund database. So whichever, if somebody gave a cell phone or if somebody gave a landline.
Yeah, all right, that's legitimate. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any other questions?
One more thing.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I don't want to betray confidence, including yours, but my understanding is maybe $300 million or $1,000 is going to be spent on the pro-con fight over the alcohol tax.
Did you say 300 million?
Pardon? 300,000.
Okay.
I misspoke. And I understand. It's not clear from the industry, but one of their spokesperson said in Girdwood that they would support a broad-based tax, but not a targeted one. So if that alcohol tax fight was there, then there'd be $300,000, available in our, including your folks, a portion of that, big portion of that, available to help on the issues.
I think that's a very big jump in assumption, Mr. Dyson.
Okay, so $200,000 is already raised, and the issue goes away. What do you think is going to happen to that $200,000?
Are you talking about who are you talking? Whose $200,000 are you talking about?
Sorry?
Whose $200,000 are you talking about?
Yeah, the people who are in favor of the alcohol tax. So if that issue goes away, what do you think will happen to that $200,000?
I don't know. Ask the people who have the money.
Yeah, I think they'll spend it on providing services to needy people. Right? Okay.
The bulk of that money is not mine to speak for. And I will say, though, about the opposition campaign is that quite a bit of it last year came from outside dollars from Anheuser-Busch and places like this. And so I suspect they're not sitting on a pile of money that they're ready to give to a sales tax. They're just sitting on resources that are ready to pay against an alcohol tax.
Even I am not that up.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you. The top areas you identified with the polling data, were those areas given out as options, or were they just open? Was it an open question?
They were. Those were 3 of 8 different areas given out based on the first round of polling, which had some areas given out, but also some blank question, where would people like to see this funding go? So we took those results to do the second round of polling once we kind of had highlighted those top areas.
And the first round of polling is the statewide polling?
The first round of polling
or you mean just
was
the summer polling?
Yes, that.
So if I understand correctly, there was a combination effort used the first time, and then it was refined into just specific areas the second time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any other questions on the polling information before we move on? Okay, then we'll move on to health impacts.
Hi again. So the reason that Recover Alaska is so drastically behind this is because alcohol taxes are the #1 public health policy that can be made in terms of reducing harms of alcohol. And this is not only based on national evidence, but also based on the last 2 times the excise tax was raised here in Alaska in 1983 and in 2002. And during a 40-year study where the health outcomes data found based on those 2 increases here in Alaska, we can see both significant and immediate as well as lasting reductions in the numbers of rates of death. Numbers of rates of death in Alaska caused by alcohol-related disease. We saw alcohol-related disease and mortality reduce. They reduced after each increase nearly 20 years apart, and that alcohol taxes are directly correlated with lower deaths, traffic accidents, interpersonal violence, underage drinking, drunk driving, STD rates, and crime, all of which we have in abundance here. And then much more recently, it was stated by a drug and criminal policy expert that a #1 recommendation they would make on crime policy and drug policy is also an increase in the alcohol tax. We have seen that alcohol taxes do not impact rates of alcohol consumption for moderate drinkers. The only 2 populations that they do impact are underage drinkers as well as extreme binge drinking, both of which should not be able to purchase alcohol anyways if they're already intoxicated. Like if it was at a bar, then the extreme binge drinker should not be allowed to purchase after a certain amount, and in no case ever should the underage person be allowed to purchase alcohol. So in theory, it's only these 2 extreme populations that would see an impact in their alcohol use. And in terms of costs, we've heard it before, but I will say it again. The negative impacts of alcohol cost the state of Alaska $1.84 billion about 750,000 of which is experienced right here in Anchorage. These costs are associated in healthcare, absenteeism from work, early death, law enforcement, and human costs such as domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, drunk driving, and suicide. These costs are spread not only through our government system, but also to each of us as individuals, as employers, as community members, as well as to people who come here to visit, and this tax would also be spread to individual consumers of alcohol, including those who come here to visit. I think those are my primary points on health, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Chair, can I have a comment?
Sure.
Thank you. And Ms. LaFrance, you can maybe help me remember, but I forgotten prior to this to bring this up, but as co-chairs of the Health Policy Committee, we worked with the director of the health department. She had a fellow who was here who did an evaluation of all the possible things that the Assembly could pursue to get greater health impacts. And in the top either 3 or 5 was passing an alcohol tax.
Thank you. I forgot about that.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go down the queue. Ms. Salatel?
Thanks. This kind of bleeds back a little bit, and I apologize. Were the areas in the polling based on any new revenue source, or was it specifically asked if it was an alcohol tax? So, however the question was raised.
It's a good question. I'll have to go back and look, and I know it was a little bit different across some of the different polls. I know that we asked at least alcohol tax and sales tax, but I don't remember specifically about all new revenue.
Okay, and may I ask one other one? And this one, were the health impacts of alcohol tax shared at all during the polling?
They were. Nobody cares. Nobody cares that lives will be saved. Nobody cares that fewer minors will drink. They were shared.
I'd like to know when, like at the beginning or at the end. I would like to know that, because I could see that there could be an impact on the tax vehicle and the areas identified, depending on what information they had about what the effects of such things might be.
I hear you. So also to say they weren't actually shared as statements. They were questions as well, like, would you care about this if it reduced deaths? So it was never put out there as fact. It was just another one of the questions. And I'll have to also look into the ordering. I know that in at least one of the polls, some of the order was changed every time. And we may not have even asked it in the other poll because it did so poorly.
Okay,
but I will look into that.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Weddleton.
I was curious. I mean, I hope that you're right, that increasing the tax would help diminish drinking and binge drinking, but it's just hard to imagine that. I mean, at least at a 5% level. What's binge drinking? Can someone drink 10 drinks? You're pretty hammered by then.
Binge drinking is 5 or more drinks in one sitting for a male, 4 or more drinks in one sitting for a female, is what the CDC defines as binge drinking.
That's binge drinking. So, and an expert just told me that a normal rum and coke at a bar is $7. That's $35. So if you pay 5%, you're about 50. You drink half of a drink less. Does really impact people?
I have a lot of different reports I can show you with very hard evidence that shows it does indeed do those things.
When we did those other ones, it was the state doing it. They do it at the wholesale level, kind of by gallon. Something like. Do you know how that rippled down to increasing cost per drink, or per 6-pack or something? Because that's what you're talking about.
So right. So the last time the state excise tax was done, it was marketed as a dime a drink. It's really difficult to actually do that measurement because of what you just said, but they marketed it as a dime a drink.
Super small impact. Okay.
And yet, because a lot of times the deaths from alcohol aren't from somebody who has 3 drinks at a fancy dinner with friends celebrating a special occasion. The deaths from alcohol are from people who drink a handle a day, and when they don't know exactly where that money is going to come from, then maybe it's less than that per day.
Thank you. Mr. Perez-Verdia?
Yeah, I just wondered, in terms of the statistics you're talking about, was there an amount of tax, a percentage of tax associated with that? Did it matter whether it was a 1% tax or a 5% tax or so?
In the reports that I have read, it did not say it has to be this amount or greater, but it's a good question. I'll go back.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question kind of goes along the same lines as Mr. Weddleton's in terms of how you actually correlate the tax with less drinking. And you said you had hard evidence, but how do they, in that hard evidence, how did they eliminate other variables? Like, you know, I look at what the Anchorage School District has done so significantly to try to make kids aware. We've got the DARE program. We've got the Every 20 Minutes program, which is quite compelling if you've ever seen it in action. You know, we certainly have great videos that, you know, come out from like the Ohio State Troopers, you know, things that really help educate people about the dangers and the risks. So how have they been able to basically eliminate and separate out all those kinds of educational efforts and other TV or any other kind of messaging to be able to say that it's all about the cost?
It's a good question, and I'm happy to go back to the articles that I mostly was looking at for these statistics. I do know that nationally, nearly every report that I've ever read, all the reports that I've ever read, and probably most of the reports that have been done, have these same results. And so, I mean, one thing to say is that the way that any policy is measured in its efficacy always has a lot of these confounding variables. But that all of them say reduced underage drinking and all of them say reduced binge drinking tells me that it can't also just be the results of a positive program that's happening at the same time. In terms of the study looking at the 40 years of data on our 83 and 2002 increases, that was in response to an article that was put into the Anchorage Daily News back in the early 2000s, responding to how the alcohol tax didn't actually make an impact here, that a reporter did based on two numbers they pulled out, and then some national experts got involved, and through peer-reviewed medical journals, published these very intensive multi-year studies showing that actually this is exactly how reduced alcohol consumption led to these lowered rates of death and traffic accidents and things like that. I'd be happy to share the articles, and I'll look at the methodology myself and pull out some of the examples.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, because I certainly see where less consumption leads to better health outcomes. But again, making the correlation between was there 1 week's worth of data that says everybody was drinking this much, and then a tax kicked in, and then the next week it dropped off significantly. That would be a good indicator of that one event that actually caused the better outcome.
Well, yeah, I'll take a look.
Because I think if you're looking at stuff year to year, you can always say, well, there was a really great campaign this year in our schools or on public access TV or radio that you could say, well, maybe it was that effort. And so what's a little bit disturbing about some of that is just that, it makes you wonder that if it's all about the money, why bother with the education part? So anyway, because that costs a lot of money too. But anyway, so just thinking this through. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned a program or something called Every 20 Minutes.
I mentioned that.
Okay, and I haven't heard of that. I'm not familiar with that. What exactly is that?
Well, actually, the Anchorage Police Department has been very instrumental in presenting it. Officer Wendy Shackelford, for a long time, ran the program, but it's done through the high schools, and they use the kids to basically reenact an alcohol-related traffic accident. So you get the local responders in on it, you get parents in on it, and they basically, in the parking lot of the school, reenact what a alcohol-related traffic accident looks like, complete with emergency vehicles and people getting arrested, and it's quite traumatic. But then the next day they follow up with basically a school-wide meeting to basically go over kind of what happened and the reality of kids dying in traffic-related accidents, or maybe ruining the rest of their lives because of an alcohol-related incident. So it's very, it's obviously very hands-on with the kids that participate in it, but it definitely leaves an impression on impressionable minds at that age. So I don't know how many times we ran it here in the Anchorage School District, but it went on for several years, and I'm assuming, I don't know, is Chief Dalston? I just wondered if he knew if it was still going on, because I know Officer Shackelford has moved on to other things, but anyway. And they've done that throughout the country with the idea that every 20 minutes a high school student is injured or killed in an alcohol-related traffic accident in our country. Yes.
Great.
So thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Any other questions on health impacts? Sure, Ms. Salato.
Thank you. So actually my cohort, Mr. Rivera, got some information about the state alcohol tax at the urging of the Midtown Community Council with our state counterpart, Senator Elby Jackson. And the spreadsheet we got for 2019 suggests approximately $31 million of state alcohol taxes coming into Anchorage. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, or if you're familiar with the state alcohol tax and the grants that go out, and I mean $31 million, and we're still seeing considerable issues in a lot of similar areas. How is this different, maybe?
Sure.
The proposed alcohol taxes at the retail level?
So I was at the Midtown Community Council meeting in December, but we didn't have that yet, so I haven't seen those actual numbers. What I feel like I have heard is roughly 40 million comes back to the state. So in the state excise alcohol tax, it is half to the general fund and half to alcohol treatment and prevention. And I've heard the number 40 million, so maybe the 31 is what comes to Anchorage and the 9 is what goes elsewhere. I don't know for sure. I haven't been able to look at those numbers. I will say that one reason that the costs are so high are because reimbursement rates for behavioral health are really horrific compared to physical health reimbursement rates, and of all behavioral health disorders, substance use disorder reimbursement rates are the lowest of that list, so it's kind of the bottom of the barrel. So one of the reasons the costs are so high are because it's really hard to pencil out a treatment center, because we just don't get that much money for it, and it costs a significant amount of money, especially when considering the level of expertise needed to deal with a lot of folks. So some of the things the state has been looking at, and with the 1115 waiver, we might see some of these changes shift, and with theoretical parity coming to mental health versus behavioral health, we might see some of these costs shift. With the state really actively pursuing a peer-to-peer certification, we might see some of these costs shift, but all of this will be kind of in the coming years, and we have been very low for a very long time. And it's also one of the reasons that there aren't more treatment centers around the state, are because it's really hard to make those numbers work out. And every time different people have done different kind of studies on fiscal opportunities, the answer is often to bring people into places that already have treatment centers, like Fairbanks, Anchorage, Juneau. That's kind of it. So another reason that we might get a disproportionate amount of the funding back. How this proposal is different, like one thing that I mean, for starters, it's just more beds. Right now, there are very few beds. A lot of people who have alcohol use disorders don't necessarily need a bed for their type of treatment. There's a full spectrum of treatment, just as there's a full spectrum of issues. But for the people who do need medical detox, for the people who do need intensive inpatient treatment, there just aren't very many beds, and there are waiting lists that have been reduced over the past couple of years, but still waiting lists. And if you know anything about addiction, the day that a person wants help should be the day that they get that help, because 6 weeks later when it's available, they may no longer be alive, or they may no longer be interested in help, or they may have found a different solution that may or may not be a solution. And with this, the treatment center that they're looking at, it's a type of treatment that currently isn't even available in the state, so people have to be sent out of state. That includes traumatic brain injury, as well as intensive alcohol use disorder, And so it would be providing a brand new resource, which I know when I used to work at Providence, when we got a brand new resource to be able to treat children with cancer and keep them here instead of out of state, like that shows huge health and wellness impacts and benefits for that person, for that family, for the entire community. So being able to keep our people here and treat them here really matters. So just in terms of the funding set aside for treatment, opening up new beds and new types of beds that we've never seen here before is a really incredible impact.
Thank you. All right. Yes, Ms. LaFranks.
So in terms of thinking to share the 31 or 40 million or whatever amount comes to Anchorage, then is that mostly spent on providing out-of-state treatment or paying for out-of-state treatment for people, or what is it spent on?
I don't know all of the specific places. It sounds like Assemblymember Zalatel might have a better breakdown for you in her printout. But I think a lot of it is going toward treatment dollars here because the state needs to help pay for the treatment because either insurance won't cover it, won't fully cover it, people don't have insurance, and what we get back, like in terms of Medicaid, doesn't necessarily meet the need. But I am definitely not an expert in that.
Okay, thanks. And if I can comment, one of the ongoing issues has been just trying to assess the depth of need and to get a dollar value around it too. And I understand there are reasons for why that's challenging and why it's not so straightforward. I mean, given that people need a different range of treatment options and they can vary. So, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if you have any data or information on this, but I was just curious as to whether or not, the tax proposals for alcohol we have right now don't really have any component for criminal activity or prosecuting. Is there any information out there that says that, like when the alcohol-related intoxication level was lowered, did that have an impact on actually slowing or changing drinking? I mean, obviously it had an impact on how people were prosecuted. But so that's kind of a question. And tied in with that is there a sense that if alcohol-related charges, criminal charges are dealt with quicker, like there's more prosecutors, people are basically in the court system a lot quicker because we have the manpower. Is there any information that says that as a deterrent as well? I guess I'm just looking at the legal aspects. Is the court and the legal system and the effectiveness of that, does that have any impact on reducing drinking?
It is a good question. I'm not positive. One thing, so I guess when I think about this list, the thing that I see as primarily helpful in terms of issues around alcohol, and this is also because I come from my organization, not just anybody, but like when I look at the core team that the firefighters have, to me a lot of it is trying to get people to the correct resources and to save a first responder having to necessarily go out because maybe it's somebody who calls 911 often, like when they have alcohol or other substance use disorder issues, but maybe that person doesn't actually need a police officer to come. They need to talk to somebody on this crisis team, and then they can filter them to the help they need. And so that saves that police officer's time, allowing them to address actual crime that's happening. But again, this is definitely not my area of expertise. I would defer to others in the room, and I am happy to also kind of look into whether there are, it's a good question about.
It would just be another interesting component to the whole challenge.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. It's a good question.
No, thank you, that's fine.
And I think just to clarify, for the S1 version of the alcohol tax, one of the amendments that was made was to include criminal justice personnel. So prosecutors and defenders are included.
That's true. You're correct. Yes. We just don't have them.
Yeah. All right. Seeing no other questions on that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to ordering of the proposals for the January 28th Assembly meeting. Thank you, Tiffany. Excuse me. So we all got the preliminary agenda earlier today. So either later today or tomorrow, a final of the agenda comes out. So there's still an opportunity for me to mess around with the agenda. So in terms of ordering of the proposals, I'll put my idea out there, and then if folks have comments, feel free. And I wish Mr. Dyson was here. But what I am intending to do is change the order so that Mr. Dyson's proposal is first, and then the alcohol tax proposals come after. So that's what the agenda is going to look like. And of course, any member can make a motion to change the order of the day. That doesn't negate that ability. Mr. Presbytia?
Yeah, I just would say that I support that the decision. As I said in our last meeting, I completely appreciate Mr. Dyson's proposal. I think it's a really good process to discuss it and to really dig into these. But I also want to, at some point, we have to make a decision. And I think having a decision about whether or not this body is going to move forward a sales tax and getting that either on the table or off the table, and it's my belief that doesn't have the votes. And so I support that, because then that'll allow us to really focus our energy on making amendments towards the alcohol taxes. So I just want to share my appreciation and support for that.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Actually, no comment.
Thanks. Okay, seeing no further comment, then I'll go ahead and make that adjustment for the final. And then last thing, any additional amendments I think members had wanted to talk about and put out in the open, any additional amendments folks were considering. So are there any? Mr. Wells?
I had intended that start date to be changed in the S2.
Okay, so that'll be one you bring forward. Ms. Alatel?
I'll just tell you what I'm contemplating. I've really been having a hard time with the programmatic aspect of both alcohol taxes, quite honestly, the buckets, besides maybe some really specific things like expansion of the core team. So I'm contemplating whether or not it would make sense for, or if we can't even do it, to have the alcohol tax, if it goes on the ballot and it passes, start the collection as proposed in February, but to require some kind of thoughtful planning before it's expended. I don't know what that looks like yet. Coordination study, I don't know exactly what it looks like. I haven't heard anything clear from the health department or any subject matter experts, quite honestly, at this point. And I would want to get a better handle on the administrative costs. It sounds like most of these things would go through the health department. And I want to make sure we're not trying to do something that's outsized to what the health department can handle, or if there are significant administrative costs, we know that prior to the first round of appropriations.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see, and I'll turn to the administration in hopes that Ms. Pineda can be at the Assembly meeting on the 28th to answer specific questions. I do feel like her email, I think, really answered in detail sort of a process of how the health department intends to move forward, including sort of a stakeholder meeting to try to figure out, like you're saying, sort of what's the plan once we know whether or not we're actually going to get these funds or not, and then a competitive RFP process. But I think that'd be good to hear from Natasha on that.
If I may, I just would say, yeah, I feel chicken and egg right now. Like, do we put it on the ballot when we don't know, or should we know more beforehand? So I'm really wrestling with that. So I'm trying to reconcile that issue in a way that we have subject matter experts weighing in and guiding this process. We get the highest and best use if we are in fact going to collect tax dollars, and that we can be responsible and transparent back out to the public and show them we're doing the work we said we were going to do in the best way we can.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, Ms. Pineda.
Ms. Salatel, are you referring specifically to this middle bucket or to all of it?
Actually, to all of it, even the substance abuse or substance misuse and behavioral health buckets. I don't know the things that we've necessarily proposed. It's what the municipality in the S2 version is doing now. I don't know if that's the best thing or if that's the best route, especially if they're talking about a perpetual funding source. And I'm not saying the programs would remain static, but it's outside of my area of expertise. so I would contemplate probably for any of them.
And I think we'd have to do that, right? I mean, you'd have a year to know, not quite a year, 9 months to know that money is coming in, and need to really do some work to figure out how specifically to use it with these visions. But so I agree with you. I'm wondering what that would look like. Does it look like a resolution we pass that says our intent to have a certain process, or just sort of brainstorming like how do we do that? Because I think that's a perfectly reasonable idea, and we need to do that anyway, right? We're not going to implement this and not know what we're doing with it. So, but let's put it in some language and.
Yeah. So if Mr. Dyson was here, he would say something along the lines of, "We don't need to know exactly what the money is going to get spent on right now. That for his, at least, there's 2 years to sort of figure out what's the best plan."
She's talking
right?
about process.
Well, yeah, and that's what I'm talking about too.
Okay.
Yep. And so figuring out sort of the process of how we figure out in that 2-year time span what's the best use of that money. That's something Mr. Dyson has talked about in the past. That we don't need to have a super detailed plan for the voters right now. At least that's his opinion.
And I have the opposite opinion. Not that it's to be super detailed, but that we need to say if we're going to put this on the ballot because we don't have the subject matter experts weighing in, that we are agreeing to engage in this process before we spend the money. But I don't think, unless we actually pass a resolution hampering ourselves, I think we would be able to, if it was starting to be collected in February 2021, it could, in theory, be budgeted and anticipated in the 2020 budget, 2021 budget in the fall, with adjustments at first quarter and other things. And so that's what I don't want to see happen, is that we haven't engaged in that process.
Sure.
And similarly, it's my intent, if I get it done, to bring a resolution that this is not the end of the fiscal conversation and the new revenue conversation by this body and with the public. Just even if we put this on the ballot, I think Mr. Dyson's proposal is very good and very educational to kicking off a broader conversation, and I want to build on what he has already presented in the thoughts of the members, because I think this is just the start of the conversation that should take many months. So I hope to get both those things done.
Thank you. Seeing no other comments then,